Hello, Year 11s. This is Mrs. Jurek. I'm going to be taking you through a revision for Biology Topic 7, Ecology. We're going to be looking at the following concepts: abiotic versus biotic factors, quadrats and transects, carbon cycle, biodiversity, and pollution. If you are a Year 11 triple student, can you stick around till the end, because there is also going to be a recap of the rates of decomposition. So we're going to start by looking at the difference between biotic and abiotic factors. So for any organism to survive, it needs to be well adapted to suit the environment in which they live. Abiotic factors are non-living factors like light intensity, temperature, moisture levels, soil pH, wind intensity, and availability of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Each habitat will have a unique mix of abiotic factors, causing different species to flourish. Biotic factors are the living components of an ecosystem. This includes availability of food, new pathogens or parasites, new predators, and competition between species. Take a moment to copy down the difference between abiotic and biotic factors and to have some examples for each of them. In an exam, you may be asked to identify the biotic and abiotic factors that can either increase or decrease a population of a certain species. I'd like you to pause the video here and see if you can list the biotic and abiotic factors that may affect an increase in the population of bluebell flowers. Carrying on to our next key concept, we're going to be looking at quadrats and transects. This is a required practical that you will have completed at the end of year 10. Just to remind you that a quadrat is a simple square frame that is placed randomly on the ground in order to count the number of plant species. It is then moved to a different random location and the process is repeated. We only count species that are completely in the frame. And it's important that as we replace the quadrat down as many times as possible during the sampling to ensure that the results are valid. Valid meaning that it can be counted on to be true. It is also important that they are placed randomly to avoid the bias from the ecologist. An ecologist might be aiming for a particularly good patch and then would have an elevated number of species within their data. In order to ensure that it is random, the area might be broken up into a numbered grid, and then we can randomly select the coordinates. This can be achieved using a random number generator or by rolling a dice. Once we have a larger number of results, we can calculate the mean. This will provide us with the quantitative data that we need, quantitative meaning numbers, qualitative obviously meaning descriptions or words. And by allowing our numbers to be compared, we can have a good idea of how the species in one area are different from the species of another area. This data can also be used to calculate the range, the median, or the mode. On an exam, you may be asked to identify this process as a 6-mark question. I'd like you to pause the video here and have a go at outlining the process of quadrat sampling for a 6-mark question. We are now going to have a look at comparing quadrat sampling to transect sampling. So transects are not random. They involve a line being placed along a varied habitat and regular recording of species using a quadrat. So an example of a varied habitat might be a coastline where we have the line going from the sea to the beach. And this allows us to see how the distribution of species changes as the habitat changes. It's a useful way of investigating how abiotic factors may affect a species. If we go back to the example of the coastline, if we're measuring the quadrats from the sea to the beach, you can picture some of the abiotic factors such as temperature, wind intensity, availability of oxygen, and moisture levels could affect the species that are present within that population. Once again, on your exam, you may see a 6-mark question asking you to outline the process of transect sampling. So I'd like you to pause the video here and have a go at completing that question. Next, we're going to be having a look at the carbon cycle. So carbon is an essential element for life on Earth. Every living thing has carbon compounds inside of each of its cells, such as fats and proteins. The carbon cycle shows how atoms of carbon can exist within different compounds at different times and then be recycled between living organisms and the environment. First, carbon will enter the atmosphere as carbon dioxide from both respiration and combustion. Remembering that microorganisms, animals, and plants all do respiration in order to release energy within their cells, and that combustion would be carried out by the burning of fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide is then absorbed by producers, such as plants, to make glucose in photosynthesis. Animals then feed on those plants, passing the carbon compounds along the food chain. Most of the carbon they consume is exhaled as carbon dioxide that was formed during aerobic respiration. And eventually, the plants and animal both die. Decomposers would then break down dead organisms and return the carbon in their bodies to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide through respiration. In some conditions, decomposition is blocked, and the plant and animal material may then be available as a fossil fuel in future for combustion. An example question is to use the information in the diagram and your own knowledge to describe in detail how carbon is cycled between living organisms and the air. If you're going to be focusing on living organisms here, then you're going to be looking at the role of the microorganisms, the animals, and the plants. Okay, so just to quickly recap the main processes that are happening within the carbon cycle, we have respiration taking place by microorganisms, animals, and plants. We have combustion that is happening from the burning of fossil fuels. Again, the fossil fuels have been created from dead organisms that have ended up deep in the ground and are now being burned and released back into the atmosphere. We have feeding, which is the movement of the carbon from the plants into the animals, for example, in farming. We have death and decay, which the eventuality that microorganisms, animals, and plants will die. They will be broken down by decomposers, which also respirate, and whatever is left of the remains, again, like I said, will be compressed into the earth and turned into fossil fuels. We have fossilization, again, what we just spoke about, so the compression of the leftover carbon and eventually turning into fossil fuels that are burned through combustion. And finally, we have photosynthesis, which is the only process that removes carbon from the atmosphere. So plants take in the carbon dioxide and turn it into glucose. Okay, the next thing we're going to be looking at is biodiversity. So by definition, biodiversity is the measure of the variety of all species on Earth or in a particular ecosystem. In general, high biodiversity is good for the stability of ecosystems. It reduces the risk of collapse that would happen if an ecosystem was dependent on one species for food or shelter. The success of the Earth to maintain viable for life is dependent on maintaining a high level of biodiversity. I like to think of this as the picturing a food web, and when you have a food web, you have several producers, several level 1 consumers, you have several level 2 consumers, and it's important that we have a balance between all of them so that we don't run too low on any particular species or that we don't overpopulate another species, because any tilt in that balance can lead to reducing biodiversity. However, as the human population has grown, the demand that humans place on the environment has increased. We have reduced biodiversity and destroyed ecosystems by using the land for three main issues. The first issue is building houses, roads, and other infrastructure. We have had to reduce the space that animals and plants have to live within their ecosystem by building these things. Second way is farming. So in order to provide us with plants and animals that we eat, we've had to increase the demand on farming, which then leads to the killing of more crops in order to feed the animals that are within the farming industry. And thirdly, mining. So mining is the removal of vast quantities of oil and metal ores. We obviously use the oil and the metal ores to build all parts of the modern world, and also to burn fossil fuels and release energy. The next thing we're going to look at is pollution. So there are three categories of pollution. The first one we're going to talk about is land pollution. So all human activities, or most human activities, often pollute the land. Most land pollution is either the result of deliberate pollution from toxic industrial byproducts, human sewage, or also from farming. When we talk about farming, we're talking about the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. So pesticides are chemicals that kill insects, herbicides are chemicals that kill weeds, and obviously fertilizers are used to add minerals to the soil in order to help promote plant growth. When these are used in a significant high level, they can pollute the land. This can be problematic for the next form of pollution that we're going to talk about, which is water pollution. So everything that humans do to the land in time will end up in the water. This is due to rainfall causing the runoff of the land into the rivers and streams. If we go back to what we were talking about with fertilizers, fertilizers again are used to encourage plant growth. However, when the fertilizers get washed into nearby lakes and rivers, they can cause the algae that grows on the top of the rivers and lakes to grow incredibly quickly. When this algae grows, it can cover the surface of the pond, which is going to severely decrease the amount of light that the plants at the bottom of the lake are going to be able to receive. If the plants at the bottom of the lake don't have light, they're not going to be able to photosynthesize and produce their own glucose. But more importantly, they're not going to be able to give out oxygen for the rest of the species that rely on it within the lakes and rivers. Eventually, these underwater plants will die from not being able to produce glucose, and they will be fed on by decomposers. Now, if you remember from the carbon cycle, decomposers also respirate, so they require oxygen in order to survive themselves, and they also release a lot of carbon dioxide through respiration. Now, due to the lack of oxygen, all of the other aquatic animals, so the fish and anything else that's living within the rivers and lakes, are also going to die. Now, this process is known as eutrophication, and it is one of the main concerns with water pollution. The third category is air pollution, and most air pollution is the result of human activities, so the burning of fossil fuels. The exhaust gases that are released cause problems like acid rain, smoke, smog, and global warming. We're going to look at more closely at each of those. So acid rain is caused by gases that come from vehicles and factories. The main chemicals here are sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides. They will actually dissolve into the waters in the clouds and form acidic compounds. When the rain falls, it kills the trees, hurts water-based life, and destroys marble and limestone buildings. Acid rain is being reduced by countries burning less coal and fighting the catalytic converters on their vehicles, fitting catalytic converters on the vehicles, which reduce emissions. This is harder to do in less economically developed countries. Next, we're going to talk about smoke pollution. So the tiny particles of soot travel in the air and they reflect the sunlight on the sunlight, causing a global temperature to drop. This is known as global dimming. It also has a short-term effect in that it irritates human lungs and leads to breathing problems. Smog is caused by chemicals, all of the chemicals above, so the nitrous oxide and the sulfur dioxide. It forms a cloudy haze that is seen over major cities and has been suggested that it contributes to lower life expectancy for people that live in these cities compared to those that live in the countryside. And finally, global warming. So carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor are gases which are all able to reflect infrared radiation. When the light from the sun strikes the earth, it warms it and then it bounces off again. The greenhouse effect is when the gases reflect the heat back to the surface, further warming it up. And this small change creates significant difference in the global climate. Take a moment to pause the videos here and reflect on the points mentioned on the slide, the climate change and what it's linked to. So the habitats destroyed by rising sea levels, weather changes, changes in migration patterns, and reduced biodiversity. Well done, Year 11s. If you are in the combined science course, you may stop the video here and resume your preparations for the exam tomorrow. If you are a triple biology student, please stick around. We're going to review the rates of decomposition now. So the rate of decomposition, like any other chemical process, is affected by the conditions it happens in. This is often exploited by humans with the storage of food in freezers or other preservative techniques like pickling. Decomposition relies on decomposing organisms to digest the tissue, and these organisms can digest the tissue faster under certain conditions. You will need to know these 3 conditions for your exam. So firstly, temperature. Decomposers use enzyme-controlled reactions. This means that they are very sensitive to temperature changes. As you should know from biology topic 2, if a condition is too cold, then the rate of reaction will be slow as the enzyme doesn't have enough thermal energy to produce kinetic energy for the substrates and the active site to bind. And vice versa, if the temperatures are too hot, then that will actually cause the enzymes to denature and then it will kill the decomposers. Second condition is moisture. Microorganisms grow much faster in moist conditions. Dead tissues are easier to digest when they are wet, and this means that decay can happen faster when there is enough water. And finally, oxygen. Nearly all decomposers respire aerobically, and again, aerobically meaning with oxygen. This means that they need plentiful oxygen to allow them to respire efficiently, and decay happens faster if there is a plentiful supply of oxygen. Again, take a moment to pause the video here and record the 3 conditions required for efficient rate of decay. Lovely. Thank you very much for tuning in tonight, Year 11s, and best of luck with your exam.